All right, welcome to the Pangburn Philosophy Podcast. This is Travis Pangburn. Today I'm speaking with Coleman Hughes. He is an undergraduate philosophy major at Columbia University. His writing has been featured in Heterodox Academy's blog, in the Columbia Spectator, and in one of my favorite publications, Colette. Everyone should go out and check out Colette. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, Coleman. Been looking forward to chatting with you.
Thanks for having me, Travis.
Awesome. So first of all, how is life? What's keeping you busy? What's new?
I'm pretty good. I'm searching for an apartment right now, so that's occupying most of my time and energy. But I think I found the right one today, and that's where I'm at.
And are you based in New York City?
Yes.
Yeah. So what are housing prices like there? It must be pretty crazy.
They are pretty crazy.
Yeah.
They are pretty good, but it's not quite as bad as the dorms. So
right.
I'm actually saving money by living off campus.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, that's good.
Yeah.
So that's cool. And so on November 17th, you'll be joining us for a day of reflection for our conference in New York City. And you're going to be on the panel with Kamel Foster, Thomas Chatterton Williams, Glenn Lowry, and others, and the topic is, can we move beyond race? And I thought the first question we could start with is race still a major problem in the U.S.?
No, I don't think it's a major problem. It certainly used to be a major problem. Obviously, we had slavery, then we had racist policies in the postbellum South, then we had after the Great Migration North, racist housing policies, racist lending policies in the North, racist New Deal era policies. We had a civil rights movement in the 60s that, it gave protections that black people still enjoy today. And it's not to say that those protections have been implemented perfectly, but racism is absolutely not the primary problem facing black people at this moment, which is not to say that there is no racism. Yes, racism exists. There will always be instances of racism in a country with 300 plus million people. If you think about it just in terms of statistics, an event that has a 1 in a billion chance of happening to a specific person on a specific day will happen in America twice a week to someone somewhere. And as long as there's somebody there to film it, it will seem as if there's an epidemic of some kind of event happening, when in reality, that event has a 1 in a billion chance of happening to any specific person on any given day. So there is our intuitions about probability are poorly aligned with the incentives facing journalists, which are to cover every outlier event and make it seem like a trend. I think most black people don't see racism anymore as the biggest problem they face. There was a Gallup poll in 2013 which found that 60% of black people said bias was not the main issue they faced in terms of income and housing and jobs. Now you might say, well, 40% say it is. Well, fair enough. But the point is that that's a majority view at this point, and much of the hysteria around this issue is the fact that people read the news or they watch the news and they see these one-off events happening to other people, assume it's more widespread than it is, and they get their sense of where America is from that, which is the wrong place to get it from.
Right. Do you see a fair amount of racism towards other races as well? White, Asian people. Is it as much of a problem for those people now as it is for the black community, or is there some percentage you can put to it to quantify exactly how you think how racisms break down in society?
That's hard. I mean, it's hard to quantify it. One thing to note is just that people are not statistical averages. So it's one thing to say X% of black people experience racism and X% of white people experience racism. or Asian people, for example, but it's another thing to internalize that statistic if you're not, in fact, one of the people, right? If we're talking about over 50% of every ethnicity at this point is not facing any kind of major bias in their life, then it doesn't make so much sense to be splitting hairs about who's getting it worse. I mean, I have a white friend I was hanging out with 2 days ago, told me a story about being on the subway, and a black guy who may have been, he was just acting strange and sort of aggressive, made a lot of eye contact with my friend, and just starts threatening him. Just looks him right in the eye, threats him, calls him names for being white. Just like totally scaring everyone on the subway. Just really, really. I mean, that stuff happens. That stuff happens to white people sometimes. Obviously, in terms of applying to colleges, Asians are formally discriminated against, as we now know from the Harvard scandal, even though we have known this for decades at this point. Yeah, I mean, let's even expand it outside of race. There are 1,000 axes along which one can be discriminated against in life. You put people in the lab, you find that they respond more to men with deeper voices than to men with higher voices. You could show bias. You can show bias. If you're short and you say the same thing as someone who's tall, you could get people in a lab and show that they're biased towards the tall person or towards the person with greater facial symmetry. But there's no reason in principle to be zeroing in on race as the most important axis along which to discuss people's relative privilege or disadvantage. It's one of 1,000 variables in life that could contribute to one having a local privilege in one's day-to-day life.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to make, that people are individuals, and hopefully we can make judgments on those people's ideas as opposed to the color of their skin or any sexisms as well. I think sexism seems to be making a comeback these days, and I see a lot still towards women, but I also see a lot towards men. So I hope we can move away from these tribal ways of thinking. Is this possible for a species like the human race, or are we going to be always stuck in this as long as we have diversity?
I read an article yesterday. I can't remember who it was by. Oh, it was Douglas Murray, British author.
Yeah, I know Douglas.
Speaks.
He's a great guy. Yeah.
Yeah, wasn't he on this podcast?
Yep, yeah, he came on the podcast, and we've done a few events with him. He was part of the big events over in Dublin and London as well.
Yeah. So Douglas wrote an article about anti-Semitism and the relationship between anti-Semitism and the political spectrum. Where does it come from, the right or the left or both? He talks about this book, Power and the Idealist, by Paul Berman. Anyway, there was a little section in there where somebody had the idea that anti-Semitism would be eradicated one day, or that it was their goal to eradicate anti-Semitism. And Douglas Murray said something like, every Jewish person I know would laugh at the idea that anti-Semitism will ever be completely extinguished. Right. Which I think is interesting. I mean, it's worth reflecting. I mean, I think many people have the idea that something like sexism, for instance, will go away completely. I think it may just not be true. The truth about human nature could be a bit more tragic than that. It could be the case that as long as we continue to be the kind of genetic creatures, apes really, that we are, we will have these kinds of biases. And obviously that's not a case for not trying to eliminate the bias. Right. But it is a case for the fact that there will be diminishing returns at some point. There will be some amount of bias harbored in people's hearts unconsciously or consciously, frankly, that the cost of trying to get rid of it will at some point begin to exceed the benefit we get from trying to get rid of it.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, as long as we have sexual selectivity. It's like, in a sense, we're creating, or we're committing these a certain amount of sexisms with all the decisions we make as a social species. So, is it sexist for one to just prefer, a sexual partner of the opposite sex?
Mm-hmm. Luckily, I guess we haven't gotten that crazy yet.
Yeah.
But I guess you could also, it's interesting, you can make the point with something like murder. I think most people, I want to get your sense of this. Most people I know would never expect the murder rate to drop to 0, right? Like, most people know that there's just a certain amount of murder that will happen, and that what we would have to do to get the murder rate to 0 would be absolutely totalitarian and not worth it. And it seems like something like that could be very true of racism, sexism, homophobia. It could be that you get a lot of gains when reducing it at first, and then you hit diminishing returns.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of a thought experiment I was thinking of when it comes to pedophilia, because if we get this new technology, this brain scan technology, when a baby's born, we scan the brain and say, oh, there's the gene for pedophilia, or whatever indicator we find. It's like, what is to be done about that person? It's like, if we know the thinking and the ideas are going to be formed in a certain way, it's like, do we still award that person the opportunity, or do we get ahead of it? And I guess getting ahead of things like this can ultimately erode some of your freedoms and your potential accesses to certain pleasures.
Yeah, I'm actually not so concerned about that, only just because my lay understanding of genetics is that there's almost never a gene for X, where X is some bad pathology. Like, even something like schizophrenia, for example, when they do the identical twins separated at birth studies, they find genes predict something like 50% of your likelihood of getting schizophrenia, but it's never 100%.
Right. I guess maybe if
the point still stands.
Yeah.
I guess the point still stands. Like, if you know someone has a gene that makes this more likely, do you start an intervention when they're a kid? How do you respond to that? Those are valid questions.
Yeah, and I think and the likeliness matters. Like, if all of a sudden we know that this child, if we can detect as soon as the child or the egg's been fertilized, we can tell that this baby is going to turn out to be a serial killer or something, like something no one wants to have around. It's like, do we move on to the next viable embryo or egg, or do we give them that opportunity? I think there's
right.
some circumstances where we might say, well, we don't want to be committing people of thought crime before they've even thought it.
Right. Yeah, and the flip side of that is designer babies, where if you have a bunch of eggs and you just know this egg is going to be a more intelligent baby than this egg, because we now know the genes that correlate with IQ, and you can just pick which egg is going to be fertilized. Right. Is it? I think a lot of people would have the intuition that it's cold and inhuman to choose the quote better egg.
Right.
But I don't have that intuition. I think if you know how many kids you're going to have and you just want to choose the highest quality eggs that you possess, I don't. So long as it was safe, I don't see any problem with that.
Yeah, you could build these financial armies of kids that you knew are going to be very successful and smart, and that's how you make your money in your retirement fund as an adult.
Right, but then people might worry that the rich will be able to take advantage of this technology, and the social stratification along the lines of intelligence, which someone like Charles Murray has worried about, will just get that much worse.
Right. What do you make of that whole Charles Murray situation, how Sam got tied up with that. Do you see any problem with pursuing any kind of race versus IQ study?
Well, I think this goes to the question we'll be dealing with in November, which is, can we get past race? If we can get past race, then there's really no reason to do the kind of research that was included in that one chapter of Charles Murray's book. So, for example, with IQ, we know that there's a reliable but small correlation between IQ and height, which is to say taller people have higher IQs than shorter people on the average. All the caveats apply. There will be a bunch of short people who are higher IQ than a bunch of tall people. But if you were to just divide the population into people above 5'10" and below 5'10", the average population in the average IQ in the taller population would be higher. We know that. That's uncontroversial to say. Where are all the articles and books about height and IQ? Right. There really aren't any, because we don't view height as a very interesting phenomenon. And I don't mean to sound glib here, but I fundamentally I don't see why we shouldn't start seeing race more and more like that. Which is to say, the amount of melanin you have in your skin is not very interesting. It's very boring. So I understand why Charles Murray may have been moved to do this research at the time, because there's this massive orthodoxy on the left, which I have been criticizing, where you measure black people and white people by some mean statistic, you find a difference, and you immediately attribute that gap to racism, discrimination, whether it's overt or systemic. So I saw someone on Twitter recently call this the racism of the gaps argument, which is it's a play on the God of the gaps argument that many religious people poorly employ in arguments about whether God exists. Yeah. I'm going to start using that. I think it's very clever. Yeah. But you see my point here. I can see why Charles Murray may have wanted to do that kind of research to criticize the orthodoxy on the left of people who do similar kinds of research, grouping the races and finding discrimination there. But ultimately, I think both kinds of research, where you're just taking a group of people, drawing a circle around them, whether it's by ethnicity or religion, and finding differences and then talking about those differences. And I think that stuff should get less and less interesting over time.
Yeah, I think it will. I just see and I hope it doesn't go the other way, where we start valuing some races over other races from like I guess from an affirmative action position, or from I guess kind of like reverse supremacy of some kind, like we're like a supremacy of other races over other races. I don't think is ever a good idea. And I mean, this also begs the question: if we did find something that we could point at to say, oh, this race is greater at 90% of human activity than this other race, it's like, what do we do with that information?
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing to do with the information. Yeah. B, the question, I mean, the statement doesn't even make that much sense to begin with, because groups of people don't do things, individuals do things, and then we analyze them at the group level because it's a convenient way of abstracting, because we just can't, it's just too cumbersome to talk about all 300 million people in the US. So with our limited brain power, we sort of analogize groups to individuals, and we talk about groups as if they were individuals, like black people are better at X, white people are better at X. But that's just a shorthand. What we're really saying is, among this group of individuals in which there is massive variation, the mean value is greater than this other group in which there is massive variation. And when you say it that way, it becomes much less interesting, because you just realize that you really can't predict almost anything about someone based on how they look. It's certainly not reliably.
Right.
So it's just part of it's just a confusion in the way we talk.
Yeah. Yeah, language and labels get in the way all the time. So, is Trump a racist? I am told all the time that Trump is a racist, and I don't see any evidence of it, but maybe it's something I am overlooking.
This is a question that I'm actually undecided on, and I know, I mean, when people are asked if someone is a racist, I've noticed they rarely say I don't know.
Yeah.
They always seem very sure that it's yes or no.
Yeah.
And that's weird to me, because it just, he has said many things that would lead a reasonable person to suspect that he's racist, whether it's seeming to equivocate about Charlottesville, or making comments about Mexican immigrants and what kind of people they're bringing over. There are also ways of understanding those comments where they're just him kind of talking and saying the first thing that comes to mind without much content.
Right.
It often seems like he's almost not thoughtful enough to be a racist.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he could be. At the same time, he could be. So I'm pretty agnostic on the question, and frankly, I don't think it's that important of a question to answer.
Yeah, it's the reason why I bring it up is because I see this Trump is a racist being thrown around a lot online, and I guess when I see claims like this, if someone claims that their 10-headed God exists in the sky, my next question is, can I see the documentation or the evidence or the studies, peer-reviewed journals on that describe what this is? And then there's usually no evidence, or they'll forward you a photo of Trump when he had shaken hands with a racist in the past. And I mean, I guess I thought, even though I agree it's an uninteresting, maybe unimportant question, just based on the type of person that Trump is, because it's hard to believe anything that he says, I think, or that he actually feels that way. But I thought it was interesting to get your perspective on that, at least to where you are at now.
Well, yeah, I guess the other reason I thought it's not so important to answer is because he's in the U.S. Political system. He's very constrained in what he can do. If he were a racist, he couldn't even act on it.
Yeah,
he couldn't make my life miserable as a black guy, even if he wanted to, in America.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like the Constitution's going to protect against that. You'd think.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Let's talk about the violence on the left. So what happened to lead us to this new wave of violence towards things like free speech coming from the extreme left wing?
What led to it? Probably a bundle of ideas coming from the academic left that have been around for a few decades, but seem to have really trickled into the young liberal consciousness at this moment, especially in the past 4 years, let's say. One of those ideas is intersectionality, the idea that our multiple identities along the axes of race, gender, religion, disability status, socioeconomic status, etc., that these are really fundamental pillars of our epistemology, in the sense that the particular identities that you happen to be that you happen to belong to inform what you're able to know about the world in a very important way, and that a conversation about any important issue in the world can't be had unless we first know what it is that you are, what boxes on the census that you check.
Right.
This is a very, very powerful idea. It's a very powerful idea. It's very intuitively satisfying. It's deeply emotionally satisfying for young kids, because think of what it gives you. Think of what it gives you if you're a young black woman, for example, it gives you immediate rights to essentially win arguments without having done the exact same level of research as someone you're talking to. If you're talking to, for example, a white man. This is like Obama a couple weeks ago at his South Africa speech said you can't dismiss someone's opinion if they're a white man. Yeah. And it's telling to me that the former president of the United States felt that it has come to that he has to say that at Nelson Mandela's centennial. But I agree with him that he has to say it, and I'm extremely glad that he did. But I think that's probably at the center of what has, because that there's no obvious place for free speech in that scheme, right? It's much like, why should I let you talk when you can't possibly know what I know as a black person? Right. Like, why? That's such an afterthought in this worldview. Yeah. Yeah. I get why people, if you're in an unfortunate circumstance of any kind, and an idea is given to you that helps lift you out of that, or gives you some kind of meaning or purpose as to why you're in that situation, and I guess maybe diverting away from reality a little bit. I can see why that would be a pleasurable pursuit for one to believe in something like that. Yeah, and what I'm hearing you say there is that it's kind of analogous to a religion, and I'm not the first person to point that out. Andrew Sullivan has written about that. John McWhorter has written about that. It is fairly analogous to a religion in the sense that it genuinely provides a deep well of meaning for young people who are looking for it and finding it there. We can't. That's a point that doesn't get said enough, which is, many people are quick to point out the bad parts of intersectionality and the various clusters the cluster of beliefs that form that make young kids so skeptical of free speech. And one thing that is forgotten is how much meaning they're getting out of it, how much genuine meaning. The meaning is real. Right. And that makes the ideas all the more dangerous in the same way that people doubt that jihadis are getting actual meaning out of their desire to impose a caliphate. Right. Like they're actually getting real meaning, and that is much of what drives this phenomenon. Yeah. Well, even and I mean, they're getting a lot of pleasure derived from that meaning, and I think that's what's ultimately driving all of this. What currently do you think is the biggest ideological threat to humanity? Is it something from the left, or is it still military war ways of thinking? The biggest ideological threat to humanity? That's a very tough question. Actually, I don't know that I have a ready-made answer to that. Yeah, it's a tough one. I've been thinking on this. What do you think? Well, I still think the ideas of religiosity and dogmatism, basically when applied in any sense, is bad for the mind. I think anti-science and unreasonable behavior are the two things I want to eradicate from this planet. So I think anti-scientific ways of thinking, those kinds of ideas, I think are highly dangerous to humanity. I'm inclined to agree with you there. Yeah, and I think having the kinds of discourse that don't fit into the TV model are really important, and I think this is adding to the fight against anti-science, and I see the world becoming a lot more secular, even though the fundamentalist voices will become, I think, louder as those
religious fundamental ideas begin to die. But I think we're moving in the right direction in that regard.
Yeah, and I guess your question was, is it something coming from the left or the right? I'm not sure that I could choose, because there's quite a bit of anti-science coming from both. On the right, it's more on the climate science front, which I think probably doesn't get talked about enough. I'm sure it does get talked about, but I don't see people bemoaning this or working on it as much as I would like. Because climate change is an extremely tricky issue, and even the solutions that seem to be on offer that are widely agreed upon by economists, like carbon pricing, the incentives for nations to actually implement them are so bad, because we could raise the price of carbon in the United States, and then countries that or companies that produce a lot of carbon will just produce that carbon elsewhere where it's cheaper. And getting every country in the world to do something at the same time, the incentives are all aligned against that, because there's really nothing in it for any given country. It's sort of like asking citizens of a nation to contribute a voluntary tax, with no threat of any violence from the state if they don't do it. Like there's a reason that you will get audited by the IRS when you don't pay your taxes, is because otherwise people would not pay taxes.
Right.
Because it's just like the contribution I'm making is so small, it's just a drop in the bucket, and there's nothing in it for me. It's a tragedy of the commons, and that's what climate change is. And it's really non-obvious how to fix that. And it really doesn't help that we have such this kind of right-wing machine of anti-science thinking and not trusting the quote deep state.
Yeah.
And then there's problems on the left too. Any branch of science that really intrudes into parts of human nature that are viewed as sacred, whether it's nature versus nurture, genetics, biological, vaccines, biological sex differences. All of these things, you get a lot of blowback on the left. And I'm inclined to agree with you that if there's one worst idea in the world, it's probably just, I guess it's a lack of an idea, really, because science, it's a mistrust of reason. It's not understanding scientific thinking. It's not understanding the benefit of testing hypotheses against reality. All of that is a disaster.
Yeah, it's kind of a lack of skeptical inquiry. It's kind of maybe a way to summarize it all. So what are you going to be working on in the future? What are your future career goals? Are you going to write a book, or what's coming up?
I'm not sure. I have 2 more years of undergrad, which I want to just focus on getting the most out of that I can. And we'll see what I do after. I could see myself continuing to write, continuing to speak, and I guess I'll cross that bridge when I come to it.
Yeah, great. And you've been doing some other work. I mentioned Colette. I wanted to mention them again. QUILLETE.com.
I think 2 T's. 2 T's.
Is it 2 T's? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Here. TTE. Yeah, so QUILLETTE. Yes. So you guys should definitely check out the Colette publication. It's a great resource for some really interesting articles. I wanted to jump to something that's really foreign to us up in Canada is the death penalty. Have you thought much on whether we should be applying a death penalty under any circumstances for criminals?
I haven't thought about it enough to have a strong opinion, but my instinct has always been no. I'm very much in the Sam Harris, Robert Sapolsky camp on free will. I don't think anyone chooses the mixture of causes that leads them to be who they are. And that holds just as much for Mother Teresa as it does for Ted Bundy.
Right.
I guess you'd have to show that in order to convince me that the death penalty was a wise practice, you'd have to show me that it was so good for society. It was so useful as a deterrent that it makes up for the fact that we're killing a person who we could otherwise just cage.
Right.
I think bad people, we should aim to treat bad people like we treat rabid bears.
Right.
If bears can get rabies, I'm not even sure if that's possible, but in the sense that we cage a bear not because we think it's deeply responsible for the kind of bear it is. We cage it because we don't want it to maul anyone, and that's the effective way to do it. And if we had a pill that could do it better, we'd give it the pill.
Right.
I think the same holds true for violent criminals. And so far as I know, there isn't. I mean, do you know anything about evidence that the death penalty deters? Because the evidence I've seen is that what deters people is from committing crime is swift and reliable and fairly short sentences. Like after a certain length of sentence, you get diminishing returns where people just don't really take on board the risk of being thrown in jail for life. You hit diminishing returns after some number of years, and it would seem to me that the death penalty is like that. Criminals just consider it a kind of far off possibility that they don't actually factor into whether or not they're going to murder this person in front of them right now.
Exactly.
So that's my position.
Yeah, I don't. I've thought about this a lot. I think it's an important. I think the reason why I ask you this is because I think it's important for important thinkers and influential thinkers to be thinking on these kind of issues, because there are human lives at stake. And I think those issues should be more pressing for all of us to be discussing and talking about. And I agree on free will. Like I don't think we can escape. Our environments can be changed sometimes, which is forced by, someone else's free will interjecting. But it's like it doesn't matter what happens to us. We're not in. It seems like we're the last to know about what we're thinking, and it seems to be happening to us, and not us dictating what we're thinking.
Right.
So, yeah. Anyways, I would love to chat with you again. I'm looking forward to New York, and I have to say, I think you are. One of the really important voices of the future, and that really excites me. It's important to have an articulate voice like yours eradicating anti-science and unreasonable behavior. I can only do so much from my end as a producer. But
oh no, Travis, you just called a black person articulate. They're going to come after you.
Oh yeah. I'm ready.
So someone called me articulate at Columbia a few months back, and I took it as a compliment. And punchline, they were black.
Yeah, I guess the evidence would be on whoever's outraged by this. The evidence would be on. They would have to prove that I said articulate because it had anything to do with the color of your skin.
Yeah.
Which I've only seen pictures of you. I mean, you could be an Asian woman for all I know, but you seem to be a man. So
for the time being,
yeah.
I could be an Asian woman by the time I see you, but I plan to remain a black man.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Travis.
Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been the Pangburn Philosophy Podcast, and let art and science inspire.